Racist cop attacks black police chief, gets shocked when she fights back. In this eye-opening video, we delve into a shocking incident involving a racist cop and a courageous black police chief. The confrontation begins when an officer, driven by prejudice, targets the very person entrusted with leading the department. However, the situation takes an unexpected turn when the police chief decides to stand her ground, showcasing her resilience and determination. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
You people always think the rules don't apply to you, don't you? The words cut through the humid afternoon air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. She barely had time to respond before the officer's boot connected with her shin, sending her stumbling backward into the asphalt. The crowd that had gathered, some pulling out their phones, others frozen in shock, watched in silence as she struggled to keep her balance. But it wasn't just the pain in her leg that left her breathless, it was the humiliation that burned hotter than the summer sun overhead. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks of color across the pavement as the officer leaned in, his voice dripping with contempt. "Get on the ground before I make you." She opened her mouth to protest, but he raised his hand, silencing her before she could even get a word out. "This is ridiculous," she said through gritted teeth, trying to keep her composure, but her voice cracked, betraying the storm of anger and humiliation bubbling beneath the surface. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. But that didn't matter. Not to him. To him, she wasn't a person. She was just another problem to control, another threat to subdue, another body to put in its place. "What's the matter? Don't like it when someone's in control?" "Newsflash, sweetheart, I am the law here," he sneered, gripping her arm and twisting it behind her back. She winced, fighting the tears that threatened to spill over. But even as her heart pounded and her stomach turned, she knew one thing for certain. He had no idea who she was. Because if he had any idea at all, what he had just done, he wouldn't have dared to put his hands on her. Not here. Not like this. The crowd grew louder, the murmurs turning into shouts. "Let her go," someone yelled, but the officer ignored them. He pushed her harder, her knees scraping against the pavement as he pinned her down. "Stay down," he barked, his voice echoing through the chaos, but she wasn't moving. She couldn't. Not yet. "You think you're tough, don't you?" he spat. "I deal with people like you every day. Always running your mouths, always acting like you own the place." Her vision blurred as anger mixed with humiliation, but she bit her tongue. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break, not now. Not ever. The sharp click of the handcuffs made her flinch. "Maybe this'll teach you to respect authority," he said, dragging her to her feet. Respect? The word rattled in her mind, echoing with a bitterness she couldn't swallow. He didn't want respect. He wanted submission. And as the officer pulled her toward the squad car, shoving her into the back seat, she felt the weight of every injustice, every humiliation, every moment that had led to this boiling point. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because while he had the power now, that power was hanging by a thread. And the moment that thread snapped, everything he thought he controlled would come crashing down. The engine rumbled to life, and the officer leaned back to smirk at her through the mesh divider. "Welcome to the real world," he said. She stared back at him, her jaw tight, her eyes burning with defiance. No. This wasn't the real world. The real world was coming. And it was about to hit him harder than he could ever imagine. But what would it cost her to set things right? And when the truth came out, when everything had, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Enjoy the story. The morning heat clung to the air, thick and oppressive, pressing down on everything it touched. The kind of heat that seemed to slow time, stretching every second into eternity. Cars idled impatiently at the traffic light, their drivers drumming fingers against steering wheels, wiping sweat from their brows, and glancing anxiously at the clock. The sound of horns blaring, engines rumbling, and distant sirens created a chaotic soundtrack to the day. Pedestrians weaved between vehicles, some darting through crosswalks while others hesitated, their eyes glued to phones, oblivious to the world moving around them. Inside one of those cars sat Danielle Carter, gripping the steering wheel tightly as she stared at the unmoving traffic in front of her. Her sleek black sedan hummed softly, the air conditioning struggling to fight back the oppressive heat outside. Danielle glanced at the digital clock glowing faintly on the dashboard. She was running late. Again. She sucked in a slow breath, tapping her nails against the wheel as her eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror. She had always been punctual, always prided herself on it. Being late wasn't just an inconvenience, it felt like failure. And failure wasn't something Danielle accepted easily. The city outside her window buzzed with life, but it was the kind of life Danielle had learned to move through cautiously. She knew how quickly things could change, how fast a seemingly ordinary day could spiral into something much worse. Even now, dressed in professional slacks and a perfectly tailored blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail, Danielle felt the weight of the stairs. She was used to it. The double takes, the lingering eyes, the assumptions people made before she ever opened her mouth. It was a familiar dance, one she had perfected long ago, learning to move with confidence even when the world tried to tell her she didn't belong. Danielle Carter wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a woman who had fought tooth and nail for every inch of ground she stood on. At 38, she had risen higher than most ever dreamed, but the climb had been steep, and the cost had been high. Long nights, endless sacrifices, and battles that had left scars, some visible, most hidden. She carried them all, even now, as she sat trapped in traffic, her phone buzzing insistently on the console. She glanced down, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read the text glowing on the screen. A reminder about the meeting she couldn't afford to miss. Danielle's jaw tightened. She had fought too hard to let something as simple as a traffic jam unravel everything she'd built. But the city didn't care about her schedule. It didn't care about the years she'd spent proving herself. And as the minutes ticked by, Danielle felt the frustration simmer beneath the surface, threatening to spill over. Then she saw it. The patrol car was parked just ahead, partially hidden behind a delivery truck. Its lights were off, and its windows were rolled down. Danielle barely noticed it at first, too focused on the road. But then the officer stepped out, his movements deliberate, his gaze locking onto her car. Her pulse quickened. She didn't know why, but something about the way he looked at her sent a chill down her spine despite the heat. Officer Mark Reynolds approached with slow, measured steps. At 45, he was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and commanding, his uniform crisp and his boots polished to a shine. He exuded authority, the kind that demanded attention. But there was something else beneath the surface, something harder to define. Mark Reynolds wasn't just a cop. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, who carried himself like he owned the ground he walked on. Danielle rolled down her window, her fingers steady on the button, though her pulse raced. "License and registration, ma'am." His voice was sharp, clipped, and impersonal. Danielle handed over the documents without hesitation, but her eyes stayed locked on his face, searching for something, anything, that would tell her what this was about. "You in a hurry?" His lips curled into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't been so cold. Danielle forced her voice to stay even. "Just trying to get to work, officer." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face, her car, and then back to her. "Step out of the vehicle." Her stomach dropped. "Excuse me?" "Out of the car. Now." Danielle hesitated, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. But the look in his eyes told her that didn't matter. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out, the heat slamming into her like a wall. Mark circled her like a predator, his eyes sweeping over her from head to toe. You know, people like you always think the rules don't apply, don't you? Danielle's chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Mark stepped closer, his voice low and heavy with contempt. People like you always think you're better than everyone else. Smarter. But you're not. I don't think anything about you, officer, Danielle said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. Wrong answer. The shove came out of nowhere, hard and fast, knocking her off balance. Her feet stumbled against the curb, and before she could catch herself, she hit the ground. The pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation. She could feel the eyes on her, watching, recording, judging. Mark's voice boomed over the noise. Stay down. Danielle's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as her hands pressed against the pavement. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew better. She knew how this story ended for people like her. What she didn't know, what Mark didn't know, was that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because Danielle Carter wasn't just another woman on the street. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't helpless. And she wasn't about to let this moment define her. Mark leaned down, his voice dripping with disdain. You're going to learn how things work around here. Danielle's eyes burned as she stared back at him. No. You are. He didn't flinch. Not yet. But he would. Because Danielle wasn't just anyone. She was the chief of police. And Mark Reynolds had just made the biggest mistake of his life. But what would it take to bring him down? And how far would Danielle have to go to prove that no one, not even him, was above the law? Danielle sat stiffly in the back of the patrol car, her wrists raw from the too tight handcuffs and her breath coming in shallow bursts as the engine rumbled beneath her. The metal grate separating her from Officer Reynolds rattled softly with every bump in the road, but her focus was locked on his reflection in the rearview mirror. His jaw was set, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, but she didn't need to see them to know what was behind them. Contempt. Arrogance. And worst of all, confidence. He thought he'd won. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the weight of what had just happened pressed down on her. She replayed every moment, the shove, the flash of cell phones recording, the mocking tone in his voice. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to make him pay for what he'd done, but not yet. Not here. She needed to be smart, to be calculated. Every decision she made from this moment forward had to count. You're awfully quiet back there, Reynolds said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Guess you finally figured out your place. Danielle clenched her fists, feeling the metal dig into her skin. What's the matter? He continued, his voice dripping with mockery. Cat got your tongue? Or are you just not so tough when you're the one in cuffs? She refused to respond. He wanted her to snap, to lash out, to give him something he could twist against her. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Not now. You think this is funny? She finally said, her voice low but steady. He glanced at her through the mirror, the corner of his mouth twitching. I think it's exactly what you deserve. Danielle's chest tightened. You don't even know who I am. I don't need to, Reynolds shot back. I know your type. Think you're untouchable, that the rules don't apply to you. But let me tell you something. Around here, I make the rules. Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line as she leaned back against the seat, her mind racing. Let him talk. Let him dig his own grave. They pulled into the station, and Reynolds stepped out, opening her door and yanking her out before she had a chance to steady herself. The eyes of other officers turned toward them, some curious, others looking away quickly as if pretending not to see. Walk, he barked, gripping her arm as he led her inside. The station was colder than she remembered, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as they passed desks and filing cabinets. Danielle took in every detail, the faces, the whispers, the way Reynolds carried himself like a king parading through his castle. "Booking room," Reynolds ordered, shoving her through the door where another officer stood waiting. "Got yourself a real troublemaker?" the man asked, his eyes flicking to Danielle and then back to Reynolds. "Just another loudmouth who thought she could push her luck." Danielle stared straight ahead, biting the inside of her cheek to keep her composure as the cuffs were removed and replaced with zip ties. "Fingerprint her," Reynolds said. "Then put her in holding." She turned to face him, her voice steady but low. "You're making a mistake." "No, sweetheart," he said, stepping closer. "The mistake was yours." Danielle's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. It was quick, so quick that he probably didn't even realize it had happened, but she saw it. And it was enough. The door slammed behind her, leaving her alone in the small holding cell. She paced, her thoughts tumbling over one another as the weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had been humiliated, treated like a criminal, paraded through her own department like a nobody. But she wasn't a nobody. She was the chief of police. And that was what Reynolds didn't know. Yet. Time passed slowly, the hum of fluorescent lights and distant voices filling the space as Danielle sat on the narrow bench, her mind running through scenarios. She knew the cameras had caught everything. She knew the witnesses outside wouldn't stay quiet. But she also knew how this system worked, how easily stories could be twisted, how quickly the truth could be buried under lies. The door opened, and Reynolds stepped inside, his face set in a smug grin. "Enjoying your stay?" Danielle didn't flinch. She stood slowly, her gaze steady as she stepped closer. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Is that so?" She nodded. "You'll see." Reynolds chuckled, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now, faint but growing. "I'll tell you what," he said, stepping closer. "You want to make this go away? Maybe if you're real nice, I'll think about cutting you a break." Danielle's stomach churned, but she kept her face blank. "Or," he continued, "maybe I'll make an example out of you. People like you always think you're smarter, tougher, better. But you're not." Danielle took a slow breath, her eyes never leaving his. "People like me? You heard me." She let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words hang in the air. The door opened again, and another officer stepped inside. "Chief wants to see you, Reynolds." Reynolds frowned. "What for?" "Didn't say," the officer replied. "Just said it's urgent." Danielle's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm as Reynolds hesitated, his confidence faltering just enough for her to see it. "I'll be back," he said, his voice losing some of its edge as he turned and walked out. Danielle sank onto the bench, her mind racing. She could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The cracks were forming, and soon, everything would come crashing down. But how far would Reynolds go to protect himself? And how far was Danielle willing to go to make sure he paid for what he'd done? The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder now, filling the small office with an unrelenting buzz that matched the tension thickening the air. Danielle stood firm, her posture rigid but composed, her hands carefully resting at her sides as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile control she had worked so hard to maintain. Her pulse hammered beneath her skin, but her face gave nothing away. Not now. Not when the moment she had been building toward was finally here. She had rehearsed this encounter in her head 100 times, picturing every possible reaction, every word she might have to counter. But none of that could prepare her for the reality of standing face to face with the man who had tried to strip her of her dignity and bury her under his arrogance. The door creaked open, and Mark Reynolds stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, just like it always did. He didn't bother to hide his irritation. The way he walked, the heavy steps, the squared shoulders, told her everything she needed to know about how he saw himself. In control. Untouchable. But the flicker of hesitation in his eyes as they met hers betrayed something deeper, something he wasn't ready to admit yet. He stopped near the desk but didn't sit. He didn't lean back or relax. Instead, he crossed his arms, his gaze hard and defensive, as though daring her to make the first move. "You wanted to see me," he said, his voice tight but flat. Danielle let the words hang there for a moment, long enough to let the weight of the situation settle. "Close the door." His eyebrow twitched, but he didn't argue. He reached back and pushed the door shut, the soft click echoing in the otherwise silent room. When he turned back, his face had hardened again, the cracks from before carefully sealed behind a mask of confidence. "You think you can intimidate me?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Because whatever this is, it's not going to work." Danielle's eyes didn't waver. "You really have no idea, do you?" Reynolds tilted his head slightly, his mouth curling at the corners. "What are you talking about?" Danielle reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her movements were slow, deliberate, meant to keep his eyes locked on her every action. She stepped closer and set the paper down on the desk between them, then slid it toward him. "Read it." Reynolds didn't move right away. His eyes flicked from the paper to her face, searching for answers before he reluctantly picked it up and unfolded it. The more he read, the tighter his grip became, his knuckles whitening as he clenched the paper in his fist. "This is a joke." "No," Danielle said, her voice sharp but calm. "It's not." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "You can't do this." "I already have." His lips parted like he wanted to argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, his eyes burned into hers as his fingers crumpled the paper. "You don't have the authority, I have every authority," Danielle said, stepping closer. "More than you ever realized." Reynolds blinked, his chest rising and falling faster now, but his voice came back hard and sharp. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Danielle said, her voice cutting through tension like a blade. "It matters because you assaulted me. You humiliated me. And you did it in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of this entire damn city. And now? Now you're going to answer for it." Reynolds let out a short, bitter laugh, but the crack in his voice betrayed him. "You really think anyone's going to care?" he said, his words laced with desperation. "You think you're going to ruin me? I've been on this force for 15 years. People respect me. Not anymore." His face reddened. "Don't push me." Danielle leaned in, her eyes locking onto his. "Or what? What are you going to do, Reynolds? Hit me? Arrest me again? Go ahead. Give me one more reason to make sure you never wear that badge again." He paced, his movements erratic now, the paper trembling in his grip. "You think you're better than me, don't you? That's what this is about. You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" Danielle didn't move, her voice dropping but carrying even more weight. "I don't think I'm better than you. I know I am. And that's what scares you, isn't it? That no matter how hard you tried to make me feel small, I didn't break." Reynolds slammed his fist against the desk, but Danielle didn't even flinch. "You're not going to get away with this." "No," Danielle said, her voice sharp as steel. "You're not going to get away with this. You abused your power. You crossed a line. And now you're going to face the consequences." His breathing was heavier now, his shoulders rising and falling as his eyes darted between her and the door. "They'll back me up," Reynolds said, his voice quieter but shaky. "The department. The union." Danielle's gaze didn't waver. "Will they? After they see the footage? After they hear the witnesses? After they hear every single word you said to me?" Reynolds faltered, his shoulders dropping slightly, his confidence crumbling in front of her. "You don't know what this job is like," he muttered, his voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to be out there every day, surrounded by people who hate you, who treat you like the enemy." Danielle's voice softened, but only slightly. "No. I don't know what it's like to be you. But I know what it's like to be treated like I don't belong. I know what it's like to be judged before I even open my mouth. But the difference between us, Reynolds, I didn't let it turn me into this." Reynolds looked away, his shoulders slumping further. "You could have been better," she said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "But you weren't. And now it's too late." His lips parted, but no words came. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle didn't blink. "Justice." Reynolds swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to the door like it might offer him an escape, but there was none. "You're done here," Danielle said. "Hand in your badge." He hesitated, then reached up, pulling the badge from his chest and setting it on the desk with a soft clink that echoed louder than any shout. As Reynolds turned to leave, his steps slow and heavy, Danielle finally exhaled. But she wasn't done. Not yet. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every officer like him who thought their badge made them untouchable. And she wasn't going to stop until every single one of them learned just how wrong they were. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt heavier now, an endless, grating sound that pressed down on Danielle as she stood rooted in place. The small office seemed to shrink with every second that passed, the walls closing in, but Danielle didn't move. Her hands stayed steady at her sides, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted just enough to hide the pounding in her chest. The room carried the weight of everything that had built to this moment, and she felt it pressing into her skin like invisible hands, daring her to crack. But she wouldn't. Not now. Not after everything. The door creaked open slowly, and Mark Reynolds stepped inside. His footsteps hit the floor with deliberate force, as though he needed each step to echo and announce his presence. His face was tight, his eyes sharp, but there was something else beneath the surface, something brittle, fragile even, no matter how much he tried to hide it behind the squared set of his shoulders. He didn't speak right away. He didn't sit either. Instead, he hovered near the door, his hand lingering on the knob for just a second too long before finally letting go. Danielle didn't flinch. "Close the door." Reynolds hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. He pushed the door shut, and the soft click felt louder than it should have in the suffocating quiet of the room. When he turned back to face her, the mask of arrogance slid back into place, though it didn't sit as comfortably as it had before. "You think you can pull me in here and scare me?" His voice was sharp, meant to cut through the tension, but Danielle didn't let it reach her. "Because whatever this little stunt is, it's not going to work." Danielle's eyes didn't move. She let the words hang in the air between them, let the silence wrap around them like a rope tightening with every second. Then, finally, she spoke. "You still don't get it, do you?" Reynolds's jaw twitched. "Get what?" Danielle reached into her blazer, her movements measured and deliberate, pulling out a folded document. She stepped closer, setting it on the desk between them with just enough force to make the paper snap against the wood. "Read it." Reynolds didn't move right away. His eyes darted between the paper and her face, searching for cracks, for hesitation, for anything he could use to push back. But Danielle didn't flinch, and after a moment, he grabbed the paper and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words, his face shifting as he read. First, confusion. Then disbelief. Then anger. His fingers clenched tighter around the edges of the paper, wrinkling it until it looked as twisted as the expression forming on his face. "This is a joke." "No," Danielle said, her voice sharp and clear. "It's not." Reynolds's grip on the paper tightened until his knuckles turned white. "You can't do this." "I already have." His lips parted, but the words didn't come. He looked back at the paper, as if reading it again might change what it said, but it didn't. The weight of the truth settled into his shoulders, and Danielle could see it, the slight sag, the shift in his stance, the crack in his armor. "You don't have the authority, I have more authority than you ever realized," Danielle said, stepping closer. "And that's exactly why you're standing here right now." Reynolds shook his head, his voice rising. "This doesn't matter." "It matters," Danielle said, her words sharp enough to slice through his denial. "It matters because you put your hands on me. You shoved me to the ground. You humiliated me, and you did it in front of an entire crowd, in front of cameras, in front of this entire damn city. And now? Now you're going to answer for it." Reynolds's laugh was sharp, bitter, and just desperate enough to reveal the truth he was trying to bury. "You really think this is going to end the way you want it to? You think you're going to walk out there and ruin me? I've been here for 15 years. People respect me. Not anymore." Reynolds's face darkened. "Don't push me." Danielle didn't step back. "Or what? What are you going to do, Reynolds? Hit me? Arrest me again? Go ahead. Give me one more reason to make sure you never wear that badge again." His breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling as his fingers dug into the crumpled paper. "You think you're better than me? That's what this is about, isn't it? You think you can just walk in here and tear me down?" Danielle's voice didn't waver. "I don't think I'm better than you. I know I am. And that terrifies you, doesn't it? That no matter how hard you tried to tear me down, I didn't break." Reynolds slammed his fist against the desk, but Danielle didn't move. "You're not going to get away with this." "No," Danielle said, her voice sharper now. "You're not going to get away with this. You abused your power. You crossed a line. And now you're going to face the consequences." His voice cracked, his words quieter now but still desperate. "They'll back me up. The department. The union." Danielle's eyes didn't waver. "Will they? After they see the footage? After they hear the witnesses? After they hear every single word you said to me?" Reynolds swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the door, searching for an exit that wasn't there. "You don't know what it's like," he muttered, his voice shaking now. "You don't know what it's like to walk into work every day and wonder if this is the day someone doesn't let you go home." Danielle's voice softened, but it didn't lose its strength. "No. I don't know what it's like to be you. But I know what it's like to be on the other side of your badge. To wonder if this is the day someone decides I don't belong. But the difference between us? I didn't let it turn me into this." Reynolds flinched, the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. "What happens now?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Danielle didn't blink. "You walk out of here and face the consequences. You answer for what you did. And maybe, if you're lucky, you figure out how to make it right." Reynolds hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached up and unclipped his badge. The small metal shield clinked against the desk as he set it down, the sound echoing like a final nail in the coffin. Danielle didn't look away, even as he turned and walked out the door. She listened to his footsteps fade, but she didn't move. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about every man who thought their badge made them untouchable. And she wasn't going to stop until every single one of them learned just how wrong they were. Danielle stood in the empty office, the weight of the last few minutes pressing heavily against her chest. The room felt different now, quieter, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that came after a storm, the kind that left behind broken branches and debris scattered in its wake. The echo of Reynolds's footsteps down the hall had faded, but their presence lingered like the fading vibration of a struck chord. Her eyes flickered to the badge he had left behind, resting on the desk like a discarded relic, its shine dulled by the harsh overhead lighting. She stepped closer, her fingertips hovering over the edge of the desk, but she didn't touch it. Her breath came slower now, but the adrenaline hadn't left her body. It pulsed just beneath her skin, reminding her that this wasn't over, not yet. She could feel it, the hum of unfinished business vibrating in her bones, and she knew there would be fallout. There always was. People didn't just let things like this go. The department wouldn't. The union wouldn't. And Reynolds? He definitely wouldn't. A knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. She straightened, smoothing the front of her blazer as the door creaked open. It was her assistant, nervous but composed, clutching a tablet with trembling fingers. The look in her eyes told Danielle everything she needed to know before she even spoke. They're asking for a statement. Danielle's heart kicked back into high gear, but her voice remained steady. Of course they are. The assistant hesitated. Are you sure you're ready for this? Danielle didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but it didn't matter. Readiness wasn't a luxury she could afford. Not here. Not now. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. Let's go. The hallway felt longer than usual, the walls stretching out like a tunnel. She could hear voices ahead, low murmurs, punctuated by the occasional click of a camera. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and her steps slowed as they neared the door to the press room. She could feel the eyes on her before she even entered, could sense the tension waiting just beyond the threshold. The door opened, and the room fell silent. Danielle stepped inside, her gaze sweeping over the reporters, the flashing lights, the rows of seats filled with people who weren't here for answers, they were here for blood. She recognized the look in their eyes. They weren't just curious. They were hungry. She took her place behind the podium, her assistant sliding the tablet in front of her before stepping back. Danielle didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She had spent her entire career preparing for moments like this, even if she had never imagined one would come so close to breaking her. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice calm but deliberate. I know you have questions, and I'm here to answer them. But before we get to that, I want to address what happened. The room held its breath. What occurred earlier this week was unacceptable. It was an abuse of power, plain and simple, and it does not reflect the values of this department or the community we serve. The cameras clicked rapidly, but Danielle didn't pause. She pressed on, her words sharp but measured. Effective immediately, Officer Mark Reynolds has been placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation. In addition, we have launched a comprehensive review of our policies and procedures to ensure this never happens again. A hand shot up in the crowd. Chief Carter, are you concerned about backlash from the union? Danielle's eyes didn't waver. I'm concerned about accountability. That's my priority. Another voice cut in. But what about the claims that you provoked the situation? That you escalated it? Danielle's stomach tightened, but her expression remained neutral. Those claims are false. The facts speak for themselves, and the evidence is clear. But what about Reynolds's record? Doesn't his history deserve consideration? Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice steady but firm. Respecting someone's history doesn't excuse their actions in the present. We have to hold ourselves to higher standards, no matter how long we've worn the badge. The questions kept coming, each one sharper than the last, but Danielle didn't back down. She answered each one with precision, carefully steering the narrative while holding her ground. But as the press conference dragged on, the weight of it began to settle in her chest. She could feel it growing heavier with each passing second, the pressure, the expectations, the unspoken doubts. By the time the room finally began to clear, Danielle's legs felt like lead. She waited until the last camera lowered and the last reporter shuffled out before stepping away from the podium. Her assistant hovered nearby, her face pale and tight. You handled that well. Danielle forced a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. We'll see. Her assistant hesitated. The mayor's office called. They want a follow-up meeting this afternoon. Danielle nodded. Tell them I'll be there. As she walked back through the hall, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving behind a hollow ache in her chest. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Reynolds might be gone, but the system that had protected him for so long was still standing. And she knew it wouldn't go down without a fight. Stepping into her office, Danielle sank into her chair, her gaze falling to the badge still sitting on her desk. She picked it up this time, running her fingers over the edges, feeling the cold weight of it in her palm. It was a symbol of authority, of power, but it was also a reminder. A reminder of what that power could do in the wrong hands. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. It was short, just 3 words, but it sent a chill down her spine. You'll regret this. Danielle stared at the screen, her heart pounding all over again. She knew who it was. She didn't need to check. But instead of fear, something else rose in her chest, determination. She set the phone down, her jaw tightening as she looked back at the badge in her hand. This wasn't over. Not even close. But Danielle wasn't the kind of woman who backed down. Not now. Not ever. Danielle's fingers hovered over the screen of her phone, her breath steady but shallow as she read the message again. You'll regret this. The words seemed to burn against the glass, as though the weight of their intent could sear through the screen and into her skin. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had prepared for backlash, whispers, and tension thick enough to choke her, but seeing those 3 words staring back at her now felt different. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And promises like that had a way of unraveling everything. Her thumb hovered over the delete button, but she didn't press it. Instead, she set the phone down on the desk, the sound echoing in the empty room. She leaned back, exhaling slowly as her eyes drifted to the badge still resting near the edge of the desk. It caught the light just enough to remind her of what it represented, not just authority, but accountability. That was what had driven her to do this, to stand in front of the cameras and strip Reynolds of the power he had abused for so long. And yet, even as she tried to hold on to that certainty, doubts lingered at the edges of her thoughts, whispering louder than she wanted to admit. The knock at the door startled her. She straightened quickly, brushing her hands down the front of her blazer before calling out. Come in. The door creaked open, and Detective Ryan Harris stepped inside, his eyes cautious as they swept the room. He was younger than most of the department veterans, sharp but measured, with an unwavering sense of duty that had earned him Danielle's respect. He closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable as he stepped closer. We need to talk. Danielle gestured to the chair across from her, but Ryan shook his head. This won't take long. She braced herself. Go ahead. Ryan's gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw it, the hesitation, the uncertainty that had been spreading through the department like a virus. You know there's already talk, right? People aren't happy about what happened. Danielle's voice stayed firm. I didn't expect them to be. That's not the point. The union's pushing back hard. They're calling this a political move, and it's not just Reynolds they're defending. They're saying you've crossed a line. Danielle's jaw tightened. I did what had to be done. Ryan stepped closer. I know that. But not everyone sees it that way. People are scared, Danielle. They're scared of what this means for the department, for how we operate. She leaned forward, her voice sharp. They should be scared. If this is what it takes to clean house, then so be it. Ryan's eyes softened, but there was something else there too, concern. I'm with you, but this isn't just about Reynolds anymore. It's about the system. And systems don't go down without a fight. Danielle's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. I'm ready for that fight. Are you? Because if you're not careful, this could tear everything apart. Danielle's voice dropped, her words heavy. It's already torn apart, Ryan. That's the point. We can't fix what's broken if we keep pretending it's not. Ryan hesitated, but then he nodded. Just watch your back. Reynolds isn't the type to let this go. Danielle's eyes darkened. I'm counting on that. Ryan started to leave, but then he paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Danielle didn't answer. She just nodded, waiting for the door to close before letting out the breath she'd been holding. She knew Ryan meant well, but his words only reinforced what she already knew: this was bigger than Reynolds now. The ripples were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before they turned into waves. Her phone buzzed again, and she grabbed it without hesitation, expecting another message from Reynolds. But this time, it wasn't a threat. It was a video. Danielle's stomach dropped as she pressed play. The screen lit up with shaky footage, grainy and chaotic but unmistakable. It was the moment Reynolds shoved her to the ground. The crowd's shouts echoed through the phone, but what caught her attention wasn't the push itself. It was the moment afterward. The moment when Reynolds looked down at her, his face twisted with anger and something else, fear. She rewound the clip, watching it again and again, her pulse quickening with each replay. It wasn't just rage in his eyes. It was recognition. He had known who she was, or at least, he'd suspected. And he'd gone through with it anyway. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her out of her thoughts. Another message. Another video. This time, it wasn't the incident outside the car. It was surveillance footage from the station, Reynolds pacing in the hallway, talking to someone off-screen. The audio was faint, but the words were clear enough. I don't care what it takes. She's not walking away from this clean. Danielle's blood ran cold. It wasn't over. Not even close. She pushed back from the desk, her legs steady but her stomach twisting. She needed to move. To act. She grabbed the badge from the desk, tucking it into her pocket as she strode toward the door. Whatever Reynolds was planning, she wasn't going to wait for it to come to her. Her steps echoed down the hall, louder than usual, or maybe it was just the pounding in her ears. She could feel the weight of the stairs as she passed, the eyes that lingered a second too long, the whispers that followed like shadows. It didn't matter. She wasn't here to make friends. By the time she reached the operations room, the tension in her chest had settled into something steadier, something sharper. Ryan was already there, his face tight as he turned toward her. What is it? Danielle didn't hesitate. Get me everything we have on Reynolds. Every file, every report. I want to know who he's talked to and what he's planning. Ryan's eyes widened. Danielle, do it. He didn't argue. He just nodded, moving quickly as she turned to face the monitors lining the far wall. The images flickered, surveillance feeds showing empty hallways and parking lots, but Danielle didn't look away. She couldn't. Not now. This wasn't over. And if Reynolds thought he could intimidate her into silence, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. Danielle leaned against the desk in the dimly lit operations room, her fingers tapping anxiously against the surface as the screens in front of her flickered. Ryan stood nearby, shuffling through files and muttering to himself as he pulled up reports and surveillance logs. The room buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should have. Danielle's pulse thudded steadily in her ears, but her face remained still, controlled, even as her thoughts raced in a dozen directions. Ryan finally looked up, his eyes heavy. We've been digging through his records, and it's bad. I mean, worse than I thought. There are complaints, lots of them. Excessive force, intimidation, even rumors about evidence tampering, but nothing ever stuck. He was protected. Every single time. Danielle didn't look away from the screen as the words hit her, sharp and deliberate, confirming what she had already suspected. Of course he was protected. Men like Reynolds always were. That's how they survived. She exhaled slowly. And the surveillance footage? Ryan's hesitation made her stomach tighten. Some of it's missing. Danielle's head snapped toward him. Missing? Ryan nodded, his jaw clenched. The files from the parking lot cameras the day of the incident, they're gone. Wiped clean. Danielle's nails dug into the desk. Who? We don't know yet, but it had to be someone on the inside. Someone with access. Danielle felt the weight of the words settle in her chest. The walls were closing in, but she refused to let the pressure break her. She straightened, her voice sharp. Then find out who. And keep digging. Ryan's eyes flickered with doubt. Danielle, she cut him off. No excuses. Just do it. He nodded, quickly turning back to his files as Danielle paced the room, her thoughts spiraling. Reynolds wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. The missing footage, the messages, the quiet whispers that had followed her since the moment she'd taken him down, it was all connected. And whoever was pulling the strings wasn't finished yet. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, there were no words. Just a photo. Danielle froze as she stared at the screen. It was her car. Parked outside her house. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the street, hidden in the shadows, and the timestamp showed it was taken less than an hour ago. She felt her stomach twist, but she forced herself to breathe. Ryan noticed the change in her expression immediately. What is it? She handed him the phone, her voice tight. He's watching me. Ryan's eyes darkened as he stared at the photo, his shoulders tensing. We need to call this in. No, Danielle said quickly. Not yet. Ryan blinked. Are you serious? This is escalation. This is, Danielle cut him off. I know what it is, but if we push too hard, we lose the advantage. Right now, he's watching, but he's not acting. We need to make him think he still has control. Ryan shook his head. This is dangerous. I can handle dangerous. Ryan's voice rose. That's not the point, Danielle. What if this isn't just a threat? What if he's actually planning to do something? Danielle's voice dropped, steady and sharp. Then let him try. Ryan stared at her, searching her face for cracks, but Danielle didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now. Fine, Ryan said finally, but I'm not leaving you alone. Danielle didn't argue. She knew better than to push him away when the tension was already this high. Instead, she turned back to the monitors, her eyes scanning the feeds again and again, searching for something, anything, that might give her an edge. The minutes stretched, the room thick with silence until the door creaked open. One of the junior officers stepped in, his face pale. Chief, there's someone here to see you. Danielle frowned. Who? The officer hesitated. He wouldn't give his name. Just said it was urgent. Danielle exchanged a look with Ryan before straightening her shoulders. Bring him in. The officer disappeared, and moments later, Reynolds stepped through the door. Danielle's breath hitched, but her face remained neutral as she locked eyes with him. He looked different now, less polished, more disheveled, but the smirk was still there, faint but present, like he was daring her to react. Ryan moved instinctively, stepping closer, but Danielle held up a hand, stopping him. She wasn't afraid. Not of him. Reynolds's eyes flicked to Ryan before settling back on Danielle. We need to talk. Danielle's voice was cold. You lost that privilege. Reynolds took a step closer. Then maybe you should listen. Ryan's voice cut in. You don't belong here. Reynolds ignored him, his focus locked on Danielle. You think you've won, but you don't even know what you've started. Danielle stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them. Enlighten me. Reynolds's eyes burned. You think this department's better off without me? You think the people you're protecting are any better? They'll turn on you the second it's convenient. Danielle's voice didn't waver. Let them. Reynolds' smirk faded. You don't get it. This isn't just about me. Then who is it about? Reynolds hesitated, his eyes flickering. The system. The people who keep this place running. You think you can take me down and walk away clean, but they won't let that happen. Danielle stepped closer. Who's they? Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in, his voice low. You've made enemies you can't see, and when they come for you, you won't even see it coming. Danielle's heart pounded, but she didn't back down. Then let them come. Reynolds' eyes lingered for a moment longer before he finally stepped back. But as he turned to leave, Danielle could feel it, the tension, the threat, the unfinished business still hanging in the air. Ryan waited until the door closed before speaking. We need to lock this down now. Danielle didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the badge Reynolds had left behind, her fingers brushing against the edge of it. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. Do it, she said finally, her voice steady. Find out who else is involved. And as Ryan moved to follow her orders, Danielle felt the weight of the fight ahead settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just up against Reynolds anymore. She was up against something bigger, something that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. But she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Danielle stood in the center of the operation room, her gaze fixed on the monitor displaying surveillance footage from earlier that evening. The tension in her shoulders had eased, but the storm that had carried her through the past several days still lingered in her chest, its echoes reminding her that the fight wasn't over. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against her ribs as she glanced toward Ryan, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the report spread out in front of him. The evidence they had pieced together was damning: text messages, financial records, and backdoor deals that stretched far beyond Reynolds. It was bigger than she had imagined, but not bigger than she was prepared to handle. Reynolds had cracked, and in doing so, he had opened the door to everything Danielle needed to expose the corruption woven into the department. His arrogance had blinded him to the truth, that the system he had relied on to protect him was starting to crumble under the weight of its own lies. And Danielle was more than ready to tear it down. Ryan pushed away from the wall, his voice low but steady. We've got enough to bring them all in. But this isn't going to end quietly. Danielle met his eyes, her expression hard. I don't want quiet. I want justice. Ryan nodded, but there was something else in his gaze: respect. She had earned it, not just in the way she had handled Reynolds but in the way she had stood firm when everything around her threatened to collapse. Hours later, Danielle stood at the podium again, this time addressing the press with the full weight of the investigation behind her. The room was packed, the flashes from cameras lighting up her face as she detailed the arrests and suspensions that had rocked the department. Names were named. Charges were laid out. The corruption had been dragged into the light, and there was no going back. Reynolds wasn't in the room, but his shadow lingered in every question thrown at her. Danielle met each one head-on, refusing to let the narrative slip through her fingers. When it was over, she walked out of the room with her head held high, her step steady even as the exhaustion pulled at her bones. The aftermath was swift. Reynolds had been arrested, not just for his assault on Danielle but for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The recordings they'd uncovered proved he had coordinated with others to intimidate witnesses and tamper with evidence, but his arrogance had left a trail too messy to cover up. His plea deal meant he wouldn't see the inside of a cell for as long as Danielle would have liked, but it was enough. He was stripped of his badge, his career in ruins, and the weight of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. As for Danielle, the fallout only made her stronger. The investigation had shaken the department to its core, but it had also forced change. Officers were removed, policies rewritten, and Danielle's reputation, once questioned, was now cemented as that of a leader who refused to bow to corruption. She had proven that accountability wasn't just a word. It was an action. And she had taken it without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, Danielle found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the humiliation, the anger, and the doubt that had threatened to swallow her whole. But she also thought about the strength it had taken to push through it, to stand up even when everything in her wanted to fall. And she thought about the people who had supported her, the ones who had believed in her when others had tried to tear her down. She sat in her office late one evening, the city lights glowing through the window as Ryan knocked lightly before stepping inside. "You should go home," he said, but there was no urgency in his voice. Danielle smiled faintly. "I will. Eventually." Ryan leaned against the doorframe, his tone softer now. "You did it, you know. You didn't just survive this. You won." Danielle's smile grew. "It doesn't feel like winning." "It will," Ryan said. "Give it time." Danielle nodded, but she knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be another battle, another enemy hiding in the shadows, another challenge waiting to test her. But now, she was ready. She had faced the worst and come out the other side stronger. As Ryan left, Danielle turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her. She didn't look like the woman who had been shoved to the ground and humiliated. She looked like a leader. And that was exactly what she was. This story isn't just about one person's fight for justice. It's about the courage it takes to stand up against a system designed to keep people silent. It's about the strength required to face humiliation and still rise with dignity. And it's about the price of power, what it means to wield it responsibly and what happens when it's abused. How many times have we seen injustice and felt powerless to stop it? How many times have we walked away, convinced that one voice can't make a difference? Danielle's story reminds us that it can. That it does. But it also reminds us that change isn't easy.
What were your thoughts and feelings after listening to the story? Did it resonate with your own experiences or emotions in any way? We would love to hear your insights and reflections, so please share your comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales and engaging content. Wishing you and your family good health and peace.